He was 22 years old, a kid from Pennsylvania, a student. He wasn't a spy.
You will tell us
At least,
everything.
that's what he told them.
Cooperate,
And
or
that's
you will not
exactly
leave.
what made it worse. August 1961. The Berlin Wall went up on a Sunday morning. And somewhere in the middle of that same week, in a cramped interrogation room in Kyiv, a young American named Marvin Makinen sat across from two men in grey suits who had already decided he was guilty before he said a single word. He had come to the Soviet Union as a language student. The University of Pennsylvania had sent him. He spoke Russian. He was curious. He was 22. That curiosity would cost him 2 years of his life in one of the most brutal prison systems on the planet, and almost nobody in America ever heard his name. Why? Because his story got buried under a much more famous deal, under a much more famous name. And that is exactly where we begin. Consider what kind of country produced a young man like that. Because his decision to go didn't come from nowhere. It came from the world he'd grown up in. He grew up in the shadow of one world war and the immediate aftermath of another. He came of age during a decade when school children practiced hiding under desks in case of nuclear attack, when the news carried almost weekly some new development in a conflict that seemed to have no clear resolution and no clear end. For many young Americans of that generation, the natural response was caution. Stay close to home. Avoid unnecessary risk. Let the diplomats and generals handle the dangerous parts, while ordinary citizens simply tried to build ordinary lives. Marvin Makinen represented a different impulse, smaller in number, but significant. The conviction that the way forward was not avoidance, but engagement. That if two superpowers were going to coexist on the same planet, without destroying each other, someone needed to actually understand the other side. Not as an abstraction, not as a collection of newspaper headlines, but as a real place with real people, real streets, real daily life. This impulse to go and look rather than to assume is, in its own way, a deeply democratic instinct, a belief that direct observation matters more than official narrative, that you should trust your own eyes over the version of events, that governments on either side would prefer you to accept. It is also, undeniably, a risky instinct. Marvin Makinen paid for it with 2 years of his life, and things that took much longer than 2 years to fully process. But the instinct itself was not wrong. The world needs people who are willing to go and look, who refuse to accept second-hand certainty about places and people they have never actually encountered. That willingness comes with risk. It always has. It always will. And the people who take that risk deserve, at minimum, to have their stories told, accurately, completely, even decades later, even when the headlines have long since moved on to other crises, other names, other bridges. Let's go back to 1961 for a moment. Not to Berlin, not to the wall, but to a quiet street in Kyiv, where a young man with a camera and a notebook full of observations made one decision that changed everything. Marvin Makinen was a graduate student. He believed in engagement, in understanding the enemy by walking their streets, by drinking their coffee, by learning their language so well that they forgot he was American. He had spent months preparing for this trip, and he arrived in the Soviet Union in the summer of 1961, at perhaps the worst possible moment in Cold War history. The world was holding its breath. The Americans and Soviets were closer to open conflict than at any point since Korea. And the KGB was looking for leverage. Any leverage, in any form. A 22-year-old American student wandering Soviet streets with a camera was not invisible, no matter how good his Russian was. They picked him up quietly, no dramatics, no handcuffs on the street. They simply appeared, two men beside him on the sidewalk, and before he understood what was happening, he was in a car, moving through Kyiv in the wrong direction. The interrogation began that same evening. They were professional, methodical, patient in a way that was more frightening than aggression. They had photographs of places he had visited, of buildings he had photographed, of people he had spoken to. They presented these not as accusations, but as facts, already established, already proven. The only question remaining was whether Marvin would cooperate, or make things difficult for himself. 22 years old, alone, in a foreign country, with no access to a lawyer, no contact with the American embassy, and no way to reach his family. He told them the truth. He was a student, a researcher. He had photographed buildings because they interested him architecturally. He had spoken to people because he wanted to practice his Russian. He had done nothing wrong. They wrote all of this down, very carefully. And then they charged him with espionage anyway. Let's go back to that interrogation room in Kyiv, because the details matter, and most accounts skip over them too quickly. The two men who questioned Marvin Makinen did not raise their voices, not once, in 3 days of questioning. This was deliberate. Soviet interrogation training in this era emphasized control over confrontation. The theory was simple. A frightened subject becomes defensive. A defensive subject stops talking. But a subject who is treated calmly, almost respectfully, begins to relax. And a relaxed subject talks more. They offered him tea on the second day, a small gesture that carried an enormous psychological weight in a situation engineered to feel like total powerlessness. The offer of tea suggested, falsely, that some normal human exchange was still possible. Marvin drank the tea. What else could he do? And he kept talking, honestly, because honesty was the only strategy he had. He had nothing to hide, so he had nothing to manage, except the growing realization that honesty was not going to be enough. On the third day, one of the interrogators asked him a question that Marvin would remember for the rest of his life. He asked, "Do you understand why you are here?" Marvin said he didn't. He said he was a student. He had done nothing. The interrogator nodded, as if this answer confirmed something, and said, "That is exactly why you are here." It took Marvin years to fully understand what that meant. The Soviet system did not need him to be guilty, it needed him to be useful. An American citizen in a Soviet prison was useful, regardless of what he had or hadn't done. Guilt was almost beside the point. To understand what Vladimir Prison meant, to understand the world Marvin Makinen entered, it helps to understand the man who was already there. Francis Gary Powers grew up in rural Kentucky. His father wanted him to become a doctor. Powers wanted to fly. He joined the Air Force, became a pilot, and eventually was recruited into a program so secret that even his wife did not know what he actually did. He flew the U-2, a high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft designed to photograph Soviet territory. from an altitude so high that Soviet fighter jets and missiles were not supposed to be able to reach it. On May 1st, 1960, that assumption turned out to be wrong. A Soviet surface-to-air missile brought his aircraft down over Sverdlovsk. Powers parachuted out and was captured almost immediately by local farmers, who had no idea what they had just caught. The political fallout was immense. President Eisenhower had initially denied the flight was a spy mission, claiming it was a weather research aircraft that had strayed off course. This lie became impossible to maintain when the Soviets produced Powers alive, and the wreckage of his aircraft largely intact, along with his camera equipment, which made the true purpose of the flight undeniable. A summit meeting in Paris between Eisenhower and Khrushchev collapsed within days. Khrushchev walked out furious, using the incident as justification for ending any pretense of cooperation. Powers was put on trial in Moscow, a much more public trial than Makinen's would be. International press covered every day of it. He was sentenced to 10 years, 3 in prison, 7 in a labor camp, and sent to Vladimir, where he had already been for over a year when Marvin Makinen arrived. The relationship between the two men is worth pausing on, because it complicates any simple narrative about prisoners banding together against a common enemy. Powers was a military officer, trained in secrecy, cautious by professional habit, aware that anything he said to anyone, including a fellow American prisoner, could potentially be reported back to his captors. Makinen was a civilian, a scientist by temperament, more inclined toward openness, but equally aware that the wrong word in the wrong place could have consequences. They were not close friends. Vladimir Prison did not really allow for closeness, but they developed something, a kind of mutual recognition. Two Americans caught in the same machine, for very different reasons, who occasionally, in brief windows when guards were not paying close attention, exchanged a few words. What did they talk about? Mostly mundane things. The weather, the food, small observations about prison routine. Nothing that would have interested an intelligence officer, but everything that mattered to two men trying to remember what it felt like to speak to someone from home. Rudolf Abel's story, the man at the center of the entire exchange, deserves more detail, because understanding him helps explain why the Soviets were willing to give up so much to get him back. He was born William Genrichovich Fischer in Newcastle, England, in 1903. His parents were Russian revolutionaries who had fled Tsarist persecution and settled temporarily in England, where Fischer grew up speaking English as his first language, with a slight Northern English accent that he would later use to devastating effect. The family returned to Russia after the revolution, and Fischer was recruited into Soviet intelligence in the 1920s. He spent decades being trained in the specific arts of deep cover, of becoming completely and convincingly someone he was not. He entered the United States in 1948 using the identity of Andrew Coyotes, a real person, a Lithuanian-American who had died and whose identity papers the Soviets had acquired. He eventually settled into a new identity, Emil Goldfuss, a photographer with a small studio in Brooklyn, who painted watercolors as a hobby, who was known to his neighbors as quiet, cultured, unremarkable. For nearly a decade, he ran a network of Soviet agents across the United States, coordinating intelligence gathering that touched on nuclear weapons research, military technology, and diplomatic intentions. While his Brooklyn neighbors knew him only as the friendly artist down the street, His downfall came not from brilliant counterintelligence work, but from something more mundane. One of his own couriers, a man named Reino Heinonen, became an alcoholic, unreliable, frightened, and eventually defected to the Americans, trading what he knew for protection. This is how most espionage networks actually fail, not through some dramatic counter-spy operation, but through the simple, grinding pressure of asking ordinary, flawed human beings to maintain extraordinary secrets for years on end, without ever breaking. Eventually, someone breaks. When the FBI arrested Abel in June of 1957, they found in his Brooklyn hotel room hollowed-out coins used for hiding microfilm, coded message pads, shortwave radio equipment, the physical evidence of a sophisticated intelligence operation hidden behind the facade of a quiet artist's studio. He never confirmed his real identity, not to American interrogators, not at trial, not for years afterward. He maintained his cover persona with a discipline that impressed even the officials prosecuting him. James Donovan, his defense attorney, later wrote that Abel was, in his words, the most uncomplaining and least demanding client he had ever represented. A man who seemed to accept his situation with the same professional composure he had brought to his work as a spy. This composure, this discipline, is part of why the Soviets wanted him back so badly. Abel knew an enormous amount about Soviet intelligence operations, about methods, about other agents. If he ever decided to cooperate fully with American interrogators, the damage to Soviet intelligence could have been catastrophic. He never did cooperate, not in any way that has ever been documented. But the Soviets could not be certain of that, not as years passed, not as pressure on him potentially increased. Getting him back was not just about morale and recruitment signals. It was about controlling the one variable that mattered most, what Abel might eventually say. Marvin Makinen's scientific career deserves more than a passing mention, because it tells you something important about the kind of mind that survived Vladimir Prison. He completed his doctorate in biophysics at the University of Pittsburgh in the years immediately following his release, years during which many people expected him to struggle, to need time to recover. He did need time. Adjustment was not instant, but his academic output suggests a mind that had not been broken, that had, if anything, been sharpened by 2 years of forced discipline. His research focus was on the three-dimensional structure of proteins, using a technique called X-ray crystallography, which involves analyzing how X-rays diffract, when passed through crystallized protein samples, to determine the precise atomic structure of molecules that are far too small to see with any conventional microscope. This work requires exactly the kind of mental discipline that Makinen had practiced in his cell. Precision, the ability to hold complex spatial structures in your mind, the patience to work through problems systematically, without skipping steps, without taking shortcuts. Because in both crystallography and survival, shortcuts produce errors, and errors compound. He joined the faculty at the University of Chicago in the 1960s and remained there for the rest of his career, publishing research, training graduate students, contributing to a field that would eventually help scientists understand how proteins fold, how they malfunction in disease, how drugs can be designed to interact with specific molecular targets. None of his students, in the early years of his teaching, knew the full story of what their professor had endured. He did not lead with it. He did not use it as a credential, or a talking point, or an excuse. It came up when it came up, in interviews, in occasional academic retrospectives, in conversations with historians who tracked him down decades later, interested in the human side of Cold War prisoner exchanges. The first night in any new prison is its own particular experience. Marvin Makinen had been moved through a series of transfers, each one quieter than the last, each one involving fewer people, less paperwork, shorter conversations, until he arrived at Vladimir Prison, which processed him with the efficiency of a place that had processed many people before him and expected to process many people after. They took his clothing, his watch, his wallet, the small notebook he carried everywhere, which contained notes on Russian vocabulary and observations about the cities he had visited, and a shopping list his mother had written for him before he left Pennsylvania, for things he should bring back if he could find them. He would not see any of these things again. They gave him a prisoner's uniform, a number, and a cell. The cell was smaller than he had expected, which is saying something, because he had tried to prepare himself by imagining what a Soviet prison cell would look like, and his imagination had not been pessimistic enough. There was a cot, a small table bolted to the wall, a window, high up, too high to see anything through, except a rectangle of sky that was grey when he arrived, and grey when the light changed, and grey in the mornings that followed. He lay on the cot that first night and did what anyone would do. He tried to think of a way out. Not physically. The physical situation was clear. There was no way out. Not tonight. Not for a very long time. But mentally, he tried to find the frame, the way of understanding what had happened, that would allow him to function, to get through the next day, and the day after that. He was a scientist by training, and scientists are taught a specific approach to problems, which is to define the problem precisely before attempting any solution. So he tried to define this problem precisely. He was in a Soviet prison. He had been charged with espionage. He had been sentenced to 8 years. He was barely 22. He was in good health, and there was nothing he could do tonight about any of this. Therefore, the only rational response was to sleep. He did not sleep, but the attempt itself was useful, because it established a principle that he would return to many times in the months that followed. You cannot solve what cannot be solved right now, so stop trying to solve it, and direct your energy toward what can be done, in the time and space that is actually available to you. It sounds simple. It is not simple, but it is learnable. The trial lasted 3 days, which sounds almost reasonable, until you understand what a Soviet espionage trial looked like in 1961. There was a judge, there were prosecutors, there were even defense attorneys, but the outcome had been decided before the first word was spoken. This wasn't a legal proceeding, it was a performance, a carefully staged demonstration that the Soviet Union was a nation of laws, that followed those laws right up until the moment the verdict was announced. Marvin Makinen was sentenced to 8 years in a Soviet labor camp. 8 years for a 22-year-old student who had come to the Soviet Union to learn. Let that land for a moment. Think about where you were at 22. Think about who you were. And then imagine 2 men in gray suits appearing beside you on a sidewalk. And the next 8 years of your life, simply gone. Vladimir Prison, roughly 100 miles northeast of Moscow, had a specific reputation even within the Soviet system, which was not known for its kindness. It was where they sent the ones they considered particularly dangerous: political prisoners, foreign nationals, people whose cases were sensitive enough to require isolation, away from anyone who might carry their story to the outside world. Marvin Makinen arrived at Vladimir Prison in the fall of 1961 and disappeared. Not literally, but effectively. His family in Pennsylvania knew he had been arrested. They knew there had been a trial. They knew the verdict. And then the information stopped. No letters got through. No visits were permitted. The American embassy made inquiries and received responses that said nothing while using many words. For months, his parents did not know if their son was alive. What was happening inside Vladimir Prison during those months? The Soviets had a system, not random cruelty, a system designed to achieve specific psychological outcomes. First, isolation, complete and deliberate, not just from family and country, but from other prisoners, from news, from any sense of how much time was passing. Second, unpredictability. The rules changed without warning. Privileges granted one week were taken the next, for no stated reason. This wasn't disorganization, it was technique, keeping a prisoner permanently off balance, unable to plan, unable to predict, unable to feel safe even on a good day. Third, cold. Vladimir Prison in winter was not merely uncomfortable, the cells were designed to be cold. Not cold enough to cause immediate medical crisis, but cold enough that a prisoner's entire mental energy was consumed by the management of physical discomfort, leaving very little bandwidth for resistance, for planning, for hope. There is one detail Marvin Makinen mentioned decades later in an interview that almost nobody saw, because it was published in an academic journal, not in a newspaper, not in a magazine. He said that the hardest thing was not the cold, was not the isolation, was not even the uncertainty about whether he would ever leave. The hardest thing was the silence. Not literal silence. The prison was not quiet. Prisons are never quiet. But the communicative silence, the absence of any real exchange, of any conversation that meant something, of any moment where one human being spoke honestly to another human being about anything that actually mattered. Everything in Vladimir Prison was performed. The guards performed authority. The prisoners performed compliance. And underneath all of that performance was a vast silence where real human contact might have been. A conversation over dinner with people you love. A disagreement with a colleague that resolves into something better. The sound of a city going about its business outside your window. These are not small things. They only feel small when you have them. When they are genuinely, completely, indefinitely gone, you understand, perhaps for the first time, that they were the whole thing. Let's talk about the daily routine inside Vladimir Prison. Because routine is where the real texture of imprisonment lives, not in the dramatic moments, but in the thousands of ordinary hours that had to be survived, one after another. Wake up came early, before dawn for most of the year. A bell, or sometimes simply the sound of guards moving through the corridor. Prisoners were expected to be alert immediately, standing, ready for inspection. Any delay was noted, and delays accumulated into consequences that were rarely explained in advance. Breakfast was minimal: bread, sometimes a thin porridge, tea that was more often than not simply hot water with the faintest suggestion of tea leaves. Having passed through it at some earlier point, the food was calculated not to starve prisoners. Starvation creates martyrs and international incidents, but to keep them perpetually slightly hungry, slightly weak, operating at perhaps 80% of their normal physical and mental capacity. This is, again, technique, not cruelty for its own sake. A prisoner who is slightly malnourished thinks more slowly, resists less effectively, has less energy for anything beyond basic survival. Marvin Makinen understood this dynamic intellectually, even as he experienced it, which gave him perhaps a small measure of psychological distance from what was being done to him. He could think, "This is a deliberate system, designed to weaken me," rather than simply experiencing the hunger as an undifferentiated, meaningless suffering. That distinction between suffering that has a logic you can name and suffering that feels random and meaningless matters enormously to how a person endures. The hours between breakfast and the midday meal were the longest of the day. Prisoners in Makinen's category were not given work assignments, the kind of labor camp work that gave some prisoners at least the structure of physical tasks. He was not part of any work detail at all. He was being stored, plain and simple, kept until his case was resolved, kept, preserved, until his case was resolved, in whatever way it would eventually be resolved. This is when his mental exercises became most important. The chemistry, the Russian, later the mathematics, filling hours that would otherwise have simply been empty. He developed, over time, a kind of internal schedule, self-imposed, because the prison offered him no external structure beyond the basic requirements of meals and inspection. He decided himself that mornings would be chemistry, that afternoons would be language work, that he would review in order everything he had learned in 4 years of university study, as if preparing for an examination that might never come, but that he intended to be ready for anyway. This is a small thing, and it is also not a small thing at all. It is one of the clearest examples of how human beings maintain dignity in conditions specifically engineered to strip it away. You cannot control what is done to you in a Soviet prison cell. You cannot control the food, the temperature, the length of your sentence, the behavior of your guards. But you can control what you do with your own mind in the hours that are, technically, your own. And Marvin Makinen chose every single day to use those hours for something specific, not for nothing, something that mattered. In the second month of his imprisonment, Marvin Makinen made a decision, a small decision that would keep him sane for the next 2 years. He decided to use his mind, deliberately, systematically, the way an athlete uses a muscle. He had no books, no paper, no pen. He was allowed none of these things. So he worked from memory. Every day, he would review everything he knew. Chemistry, because he was a chemistry student. He would go through reactions in his head, step by step, as precisely as if he were writing them in a laboratory notebook. If he made an error, he would start again from the beginning. Not as punishment, as discipline, as proof to himself that his mind was still his, that they had taken his freedom, his comfort, his contact with the world, but they had not taken his capacity to think. He also worked on Russian, which had a dark irony to it. He had come to the Soviet Union to improve his Russian, and in Vladimir Prison, with nothing else to do, he became genuinely fluent. Not the conversational fluency of a student, but the deep structural fluency of someone who had spent hundreds of hours alone with a language, finding its architecture, its logic, its exceptions. There was another prisoner in Vladimir, an American, named Francis Gary Powers. The name means something to most Americans of a certain age. Powers was the U-2 pilot shot down over the Soviet Union in 1960. The man whose capture had destroyed the Paris summit, had ended whatever slim chance existed for a diplomatic thaw, had handed the Soviets one of their greatest propaganda victories of the Cold War. Powers had been sentenced to 10 years. He was at Vladimir, and he and Makinen, in the careful, monitored way that Vladimir Prison permitted, began to communicate. Not openly, not with conversations, but prisoners find ways. They always find ways. Small signals, patterns in behavior, brief exchanges in moments when observation lapsed. They were two Americans, by himself, inside a Soviet prison, trying to remind each other that there was a world outside, and that someone in that world knew they existed. Back in Pennsylvania, Marvin's family was not sitting quietly. His mother, Dorothy Makinen, had begun writing letters to everyone she could think of. To her congressmen, to senators, to the State Department, to the White House. Most of these letters received polite, non-committal responses, the kind of response designed to make someone feel heard, while ensuring that nothing actually happens. Dorothy Makinen deserves more than a paragraph. She was a woman of her time and place. A Pennsylvania housewife in 1961, which meant she had been told in countless ways that the big decisions happened elsewhere. In Washington, in conference rooms, in the offices of people who had gone to the right schools and held the right titles. She did not have access to any of those rooms. She had a kitchen table, a typewriter, and a son who was sitting in a Soviet prison, while the people who were supposed to help sent her polite letters that said nothing. So she kept typing. Week after week, she refined her letters, made them more precise, more targeted, more difficult to dismiss with a form response. She learned the names of the specific people she needed to reach, not just senators, but the specific aides on specific committees who actually read the mail, who actually made decisions about what their bosses would see. She connected with other families, and they began to function as something like an informal organization, sharing information, coordinating their approaches, presenting a unified front to officials who had found it easy to ignore one mother and found it considerably harder to ignore a dozen. This is how change actually happens, most of the time. Not through heroic individual action, not through dramatic confrontations, but through patient, persistent, unglamorous work done by people who refuse to accept that the answer they have been given is the only answer available. Dorothy Makinen did not rescue her son single-handedly. The rescue required governments and diplomats and lawyers, but she kept his name alive. She kept the question open, and that mattered more than anyone officially acknowledged. James Donovan knew Makinen's name because Dorothy Makinen had made it impossible not to. What they didn't know was that in Washington and in Moscow, a very different kind of conversation was beginning. And the Americans held something the Soviets wanted, something that might, just might, be worth trading for. His name was Rudolf Abel, and his story changes everything. Rudolf Abel had been living in Brooklyn for years under a false name, running one of the most sophisticated Soviet intelligence networks ever operated on American soil. His real name was William Fischer. He was born in England to Russian parents. He spoke English without an accent. He painted watercolors. He played jazz guitar. He was, by all accounts, a charming and cultured man who had spent the better part of a decade stealing American atomic secrets and transmitting them to Moscow. The FBI arrested him in 1957 after a courier defected and gave up his location. He was tried, convicted, sentenced to 32 years in federal prison. And for 4 years, he sat in a federal penitentiary in Atlanta, while the Soviets, very quietly and deliberately, began to build the case for a trade. The man who handled the American side of the Abel negotiation was a lawyer from Brooklyn named James Donovan. And if that name sounds familiar, it should. He's the man Tom Hanks played in Bridge of Spies, 2015. But the movie, as movies always do, simplified things considerably. The real James Donovan was a complicated man. He had been one of the American prosecutors at Nuremberg. He had defended Abel at trial. Not because he believed Abel was innocent. He knew Abel was guilty. But because he believed, genuinely and deeply, that even a Soviet spy deserved a competent legal defense. Because that was what American law required. And American law was something worth defending. Donovan had written in his sentencing brief that Abel might be worth more alive than dead. That in a future conflict, he might be tradable for an American held by the Soviets. He was right. More right than he knew. Because at the time he wrote those words, Gary Powers had not yet been shot down, and Marvin Makinen had not yet been arrested, and Donovan had no specific American in mind. He was thinking ahead, into a future he couldn't see clearly, and leaving a door open, just in case. One last detail that historians have noted about the negotiations between Donovan and the Soviets. In the months before the Glienicke exchange, the talks did not happen in grand government buildings with flags and formal seating. They happened, more often, in modest meeting rooms, sometimes in East Berlin apartments borrowed for the occasion, with Donovan, an American civilian lawyer, sitting across from Soviet intermediaries who were themselves never quite officially representing the Soviet government, even though everyone in the room understood exactly who they answered to. This deliberate ambiguity, this careful avoidance of anything that looked official, was itself a form of protection for both sides. If the talks failed, no government had to admit that it had ever engaged in them. Donovan kept detailed notes of these meetings, which later informed his memoir, and which gave historians a rare window into how this strange diplomacy actually worked, person to person, in rooms with no cameras, no formal record, just two men trying to find a way to move other men across a line on a map, without either government losing face. It is easy, looking back, to see the Cold War as a chess match played by faceless institutions. But it was always, underneath that framing, a series of conversations between actual people making actual decisions in actual rooms that determined whether someone like Marvin Makinen would spend another year in a cold cell, or would finally cross back into the world he had left behind. The negotiations began in earnest in 1961. The Soviets wanted Abel back, not because Abel had information that was still current. The intelligence world moves too fast for a spy who has been in prison for 4 years. They wanted him back for a different reason. Because to leave him in an American prison was to signal to every Soviet intelligence officer operating abroad that if you are caught, Moscow will not come for you. You will simply disappear. That signal alone was corrosive. It damaged recruitment, morale, the willingness of people to take risks on behalf of the Soviet state. Powers was the obvious candidate for exchange. He was the most famous American prisoner in the Soviet Union. His return would be the most visible, the most newsworthy, the most useful to both governments as a demonstration that dialogue was still possible, even at the height of the Cold War. But James Donovan, sitting across the table from Soviet officials in East Berlin in the early months of 1962, did something that was either brilliant or presumptuous, depending on your perspective. He asked for 2 Americans, not just Powers, 2. And the second name he put on the table was Marvin Makinen. The Soviets, to the surprise of some American officials who knew about the negotiation, said yes. February 10th, 1962, the Glienicke Bridge, Berlin, 6:30 in the morning. It was dark, freezing, and almost completely empty, except for a small group of men standing at the precise midpoint where the Western Zone ended and the Eastern Zone began. On one side, James Donovan and American officials, and Rudolf Abel, the professional composure of a man who had spent his entire career pretending that extraordinary situations were ordinary. On the other side, Soviet officials and Gary Powers, who had spent almost 2 years in Vladimir Prison and who, by February of 1962, looked significantly older than the photographs taken before his capture. The exchange itself took approximately 4 minutes. 4 minutes to undo 2 years of imprisonment. Powers crossed to the west, Abel crossed to the east, and the Glienicke Bridge went back to being just a bridge. But here is the part of this story that most people don't know, and that most accounts of the Glienicke exchange either minimize or omit entirely. Marvin Makinen was not on that bridge. He was still in Vladimir Prison. Let that register. Donovan had negotiated for 2 Americans. The Soviets had agreed. Then, on the day of the exchange, only Powers came across. How? The official explanation from the Soviet side was procedural, a paperwork issue, a timing problem, nothing intentional. Donovan didn't believe it. The State Department didn't believe it. Marvin Makinen, for his part, sitting in a cell in Vladimir Prison several hundred miles from that bridge, had no way of knowing that his name had been part of the deal, or that the deal had just been executed without him. There is a broader context here that helps explain why this entire system existed, why governments on both sides of the Iron Curtain maintained year after year a quiet, complicated machinery for trading human beings, like pieces on a chessboard. The Cold War was not primarily a war of armies. For most of its duration, the 2 superpowers never directly fought each other on a battlefield. Instead, it was a war of intelligence, of information, of knowing what the other side knew and not knowing what they didn't. In this kind of war, people become extraordinarily valuable, not for their labor, not for their military skill, but for what they know, or what they might know, or what they might be able to find out. A spy who is captured represents a specific kind of loss, not just to the individual, but to the intelligence apparatus that trained them, that invested years, sometimes decades, in building their cover, their network, their access. This is why exchanges happened, Not out of sentiment, not because either government particularly cared about the individual humans involved, but because the system itself required a release valve, a way to recover assets without escalating to actual conflict. That same bridge became, almost by accident, the physical location where this release valve operated. It was chosen initially for practical reasons. It sat precisely on the border between American and Soviet zones of control in Berlin. It was relatively isolated, easy to secure, easy to control access to, on a particular cold morning in February, and it became, through repeated use, something closer to a tradition, a known venue for this specific, strange kind of diplomacy. Understanding this system helps explain something important about why Marvin Makinen was left behind on the day powers crossed. It was almost certainly not personal. It was almost certainly not punitive. It was, more likely, a bureaucratic complication. A piece of paperwork that hadn't been finalized. A signature that hadn't been obtained. A detail that, in a system handling human beings as if they were cargo manifests, simply hadn't been checked off in time. And that's more disturbing than outright cruelty. Intentional cruelty, at least, has a logic, a reason, even a bad one. Bureaucratic indifference, the possibility that a human being remained in a Soviet prison for an additional 18 months because of a paperwork delay, is a different kind of horror. Quieter, more mundane. Just quieter. More representative of how large systems actually fail people. Not through dramatic villainy, but through the simple fact that when you are processing thousands of cases across multiple government agencies in 2 different countries with competing priorities, individual human beings sometimes simply fall through the cracks. The cracks, in Marvin Makinen's case, lasted 18 months. That is worth remembering whenever we encounter modern versions of the same dynamic. Government processes that move slowly, cases that get delayed, paperwork that takes longer than it should, while real human beings wait, and wait, and wait. The machinery doesn't usually intend cruelty. It simply isn't built with urgency as its primary value. And the people caught inside it pay the price for that design choice. He simply remained in the prison, in the cold, for another year and a half, while diplomats argued, and his mother kept writing letters. And the world moved on to its next crisis. What happened during those additional 18 months? Makinen later described it as the most difficult period of the entire imprisonment. Not because conditions worsened dramatically, but because hope had been allowed in, and then withdrawn. There is a particular cruelty to that. To being told, indirectly, through rumor and inference, that an arrangement had been made, that you were going home, and then continuing to sit in the same cell, in the same cold, looking at the same walls. He continued his mental discipline, the chemistry reviews, his Russian. He had added mathematics by this point, working through problems from memory, building imaginary structures in his mind that he could enter and move through when the cell became too small. This is not metaphor. This is how he described it, as a technique, as something he taught himself to do. Because the alternative was to stop. The second exchange, the one that actually included Marvin Makinen, happened in the summer of 1962 at the Heerstrasse checkpoint in Berlin. Quieter than the Glienicke exchange, less photographed, less reported, less remembered. He crossed into the West on a warm summer morning, almost exactly 2 years after his arrest. 2 years that had cost him things that don't appear in official documents, things that took years to name and longer to process. He flew back to the United States, debriefed by American intelligence officials who were interested in everything he had seen and heard inside Vladimir, the other prisoners, the routines, the techniques, the names. This debriefing lasted weeks. It's worth following Gary Powers' story a little further because it offers an instructive contrast to Marvin Makinen's quieter path. When Powers returned to the United States, he did not receive the hero's welcome that some Americans expected. Instead, he faced suspicion. Why had he not used the suicide device that U-2 pilots were supposedly equipped with? Why had he allowed himself to be captured alive? Why had he, during his time in Soviet custody, made certain statements that sounded, to some American ears, like cooperation? A congressional committee investigated his conduct. He was cleared of any wrongdoing, but the cloud never fully lifted. Powers spent the rest of his life defending himself, defending 3 minutes he didn't choose. During those few minutes, when his aircraft was hit, and the much longer period afterward, when he was a prisoner trying to survive, he worked for Lockheed for a time, testing aircraft, then became a helicopter pilot for a Los Angeles television station, reporting on traffic from the air. A strange, final chapter for a man who had once flown the most secret aircraft in the American arsenal over the most secret installations in the Soviet Union. He died in 1977 in a helicopter crash while covering a story for that same television station. The helicopter ran out of fuel, an ordinary, almost mundane accident for a man whose life had included some of the most dramatic moments of the entire Cold War. His reputation was posthumously rehabilitated in 2012. He was awarded the Silver Star, decades after his death, for the way he had conducted himself during his captivity, an acknowledgement that came far too late to matter to the man himself, but that mattered, presumably, to the family he left behind. Compare this to Marvin Makinen, who received no medal, no formal acknowledgement, no Hollywood film about his specific story, who simply went back to school and built a quiet, significant life in a laboratory, far from any spotlight. The two of them, held in the same prison for overlapping reasons, released through related, though distinct, negotiations, who took completely different paths through the rest of their lives. Powers, perhaps because his case was more public, spent decades managing a public narrative about what he had and hadn't done. Makinen, because his case faded from public attention, was free, in a strange way, to simply live without that particular burden. There is no clean lesson here, no simple statement about which path was better. Both men endured something genuinely terrible. Both men found ways to continue, one in the public eye, one almost entirely outside of it. Both, in their own ways, demonstrating that survival takes many forms, and that there is no single correct way to carry the weight of what was done to you. Why does this story matter now? Why tell it today, more than 60 years after it happened, to an audience that may never have heard Marvin Makinen's name before this moment? Because the dynamics that shaped his life have not disappeared. They have simply changed shape. There are still governments that hold foreign nationals for reasons that have more to do with leverage than with actual guilt. There are still families writing letters that officials respond to politely and do nothing about. There are still young people traveling abroad with curiosity rather than caution, who do not fully understand how quickly the ground can shift beneath them. In a world where geopolitics can transform an ordinary student into a bargaining chip overnight. And there are still people today enduring difficult, isolating circumstances who could learn something from the specific, practical way Marvin Makinen kept his mind intact. Not through some mystical reserve of strength, but through deliberate, daily practice, chosen and repeated, even when no one was watching, even when there was no guarantee that it would ever matter. That is a practical lesson available to anyone facing their own version of isolation, their own version of uncertainty, their own version of a cell that might be physical or might be something else entirely. A diagnosis, a loss, a circumstance that traps you in ways that feel, at times, just as confining as four walls and a high, barred window. The lesson is not complicated. Find something to do with your mind every single day. Something that is entirely yours, that no one can take from you. Not because it will fix everything, it won't, but because it is one of the only things that remains within your control when almost everything else has been taken away. After that, Marvin Makinen went back to school. Let's also be honest about something that accounts of this story often skip over. Marvin Makinen's relationship with his own past was not simple, and it did not resolve itself neatly into a clean narrative of triumph. For years after his return, he experienced what we would today recognize as symptoms of what doctors now call post-traumatic stress, though that term and that understanding did not yet exist in any formal sense in the medical literature of the early 1960s. He had difficulty sleeping for a long time. Cold rooms bothered him in ways that seemed disproportionate to people who didn't know his history. Certain sounds, the particular metallic clang of a door closing in a specific way, could trigger a response that had nothing to do with his present surroundings and everything to do with 2 years in a cell in Vladimir. This is worth saying plainly, because the version of this story that ends simply with "he went back to school and built a great career" is true, but incomplete. The fuller truth includes the years of adjustment, the nights that were harder than others, the conversations he could not have, even with people who loved him, because there were simply no words yet for what he had experienced. His scientific work, in some real sense, was part of how he processed what happened to him, not as therapy in any formal sense, but as a place where his mind could go, that had clear rules, clear methods, clear, verifiable answers, in a world that had taught him how arbitrary and uncertain everything else could be. A protein has a structure. That structure can be determined through careful, patient work. The answer, once found, does not change based on the whims of an interrogator or the shifting priorities of a government. It simply is what it is, and there is something deeply stabilizing about spending your career in that kind of certainty. After spending 2 years, in conditions specifically designed to deny you any certainty at all. This is speculation to some degree. Makinen himself was not always explicit about the connection between his imprisonment and his choice of scientific field. But the pattern is suggestive, and it offers a useful way of thinking about how people actually heal. Not through forgetting, not through some single moment of resolution, but through finding, often without fully realizing it, the specific kind of work that rebuilds, piece by piece, the sense of order and meaning that trauma takes away. There is a question that comes up when people learn about this story, a question that is reasonable and deserves a direct answer. Was Marvin Makinen actually a spy? The short answer is no. There is no credible evidence that he was engaged in intelligence activities. The longer answer is more complicated, because in the Cold War, the line between a curious student and an intelligence asset was not always as clear as either side pretended. American universities in the 1960s were connected to the intelligence community in ways that would seem extraordinary today. Student exchange programs, language programs, academic conferences, all of these were potential vectors for information gathering on both sides. The KGB did not arrest random American students on a whim. They had reasons, they had files, they had watched him before they moved. What those files contained remains unknown. What is known is that whatever he did or didn't do, an 8-year sentence in a Soviet labor camp was a wildly disproportionate response. This is the part of his story that is perhaps the most remarkable. Not the imprisonment, not the exchange, but what came after. He finished his chemistry degree. He earned a doctorate. He became a professor at the University of Chicago, where he spent his career doing research. Real research, important research, on protein structure and molecular biology. He did not become a public figure. He did not write a best-selling memoir. He did not go on the lecture circuit. He went back to his laboratory, and he worked. His research on protein structure contributed to fields that matter, that are still being built upon today, by scientists who may have no idea that one of the people whose work they are standing on spent 2 years keeping his mind alive by reviewing chemical reactions in a cold cell, because he refused to let them take the only thing that was really his. Here is what I want to say about Marvin Makinen, and I want to say it directly, without softening it, without making it neater than it actually is. He was an ordinary person who found himself in an extraordinary situation that he did not seek, did not deserve, and could not have anticipated. There is something genuinely American about the impulse that brought him there. Not the naive part, not the part that didn't account for the risk, but the underlying belief that understanding is better than ignorance, that the way to deal with the thing you fear is to go toward it, not away from it, and to look at it clearly. That impulse got him arrested, put him in a Soviet prison for 2 years, and it was still, in some essential way, the right impulse. What does his story tell us about survival? Not the Hollywood version, not the version where someone discovers a hidden strength, has a breakthrough moment, transforms into something greater than they were. Real survival, the kind Marvin Makinen practiced in that cell, is quieter than that, and harder, and less dramatic, and more impressive. It's reviewing chemistry reactions in your head because you refuse to let your mind go soft. It's endurance. Not as a one-time act of heroism, but as a daily practice. Every morning, a choice to continue. The Glienicke Bridge is still there, still crossing the same water, still connecting the same 2 banks. A physical object that outlasted everything that made it historically significant. East and West Germany ceased to exist as separate entities in 1990. The checkpoint is gone. The division is gone. The Cold War is over, in the political sense. Marvin Makinen outlasted it too. a man who was almost forgotten by history, who was traded like a commodity, whose name was added to a negotiation by a lawyer from Brooklyn who barely knew him, and who turned 2 years in a Soviet prison into a lifetime of serious, quiet, important work. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, an extraordinary thing. One final thing about what it means to be a pawn. The men who walked across that bridge, on both sides, knew something that most people never learn, which is what it feels like to be a piece on a board, moved by hands that have interests that have nothing to do with you personally. What do you do with that knowledge? There are two options. You can let it make you cynical. You can let it confirm every suspicion you ever had that the powerful do not care about the powerless, that systems are not designed for the people inside them, that hope is a trap. Or you can do what Marvin Makinen did. You can go back to school. You can pick up where you left off, altered, permanently changed, but not defeated, not defined by what was done to you, but by what you chose to do next. That is not a simple choice. There is nothing naive about it. It requires something harder than cynicism and harder than optimism, a clear-eyed decision to invest in something anyway. That decision, made by a 23-year-old, on a plane flying back to the country, is the center of this story. Not the bridge, not the spy trade, not the KGB, not the cold. The decision to continue. Vladimir Prison itself still exists today as a functioning correctional facility in modern Russia. The walls Marvin Makinen once stared at are still standing, holding different prisoners now, for different reasons, in a different political era. But the building itself, that specific architecture of confinement, continues its work, largely unchanged. There is something fitting and something deeply unsettling about that continuity. Empires fall, walls come down, ideologies that once seemed permanent dissolve into history. But prisons, it seems, endure. The specific Soviet Union that imprisoned Marvin Makinen no longer exists. It dissolved in 1991, less than 30 years after his release. The KGB was formally disbanded, replaced by successor agencies, operating under different names, with different mandates. The Cold War itself, officially ended, became something studied in history classes, rather than lived through in daily anxiety. And yet, if you stand today on the Glienicke Bridge, now simply a peaceful crossing between two parts of a unified Germany, you would have no way of knowing, looking at the quiet water below, that this exact spot once hosted some of the most tense, carefully choreographed moments of an entire global conflict. Human beings exchanged like currency at dawn through the cold, while the fate of nations hung on the precise execution of a 4-minute walk. This is, perhaps, the final lesson of Marvin Makinen's story. History does not announce itself while it is happening. It simply occurs, in ordinary moments to ordinary people who could not have known, as they lived through it, that decades later, someone would be telling their story to an audience they never imagined, in a format they could not have conceived of, trying to extract some meaning from what, at the time, simply felt like survival. Marvin Makinen was 22. He had a camera and a notebook and a belief that understanding mattered. That belief cost him 2 years of his life, and it never stopped being true. There is a photograph that exists from the day Marvin Makinen returned to Pennsylvania in the summer of 1962. It shows him standing on the tarmac, thinner than he had been, paler, but standing upright. His mother beside him, her hand on his arm, as if she needed to confirm, through physical contact, that this was real. The 2 years of letters had finally produced this moment. Her son, standing in front of her, breathing American air. Dorothy Makinen did not become a public advocate for other prisoners' families. After her son came home, she did not write a book. She did not go on television. She went back to her ordinary life, in her ordinary house, in Pennsylvania, having done the most extraordinary thing a mother can do, which is refuse to give up on someone the world had written off. There were other mothers, in other towns, writing similar letters about similar sons and daughters, held in similar prisons around the world, throughout the Cold War, and throughout every conflict before and since. Most of those mothers are never remembered. Their names do not appear in history books. Their letters are not preserved in archives. Their persistence, their refusal to accept polite, non-committal responses, simply becomes part of the background noise of a war that ground on for decades, consuming ordinary people in ways that rarely made headlines. Dorothy Makinen is remembered only because her son became, briefly, part of a larger story, a story about pilots and spies and bridges. Her own contribution, the 1,000 letters, the kitchen table, the refusal to stop, is a footnote in most accounts of this period, when it should be closer to the center. This is true of most history. The people who do the patient, unglamorous work that actually moves things forward are rarely the names that get remembered. The names we remember are usually the ones who happen to be standing at the most photographed moment, on the most famous bridge. That is not fair. It is simply how memory works, how history gets written. And it is worth pausing on, because somewhere, right now, there is probably a mother, or a father, or a spouse, sending letters that nobody will remember, on behalf of someone whose name you will never learn. And the outcome of those letters matters just as much as anything that happened on the Glienicke Bridge. There is one more piece of this story that deserves attention before we close. In the decades after his release, Marvin Makinen occasionally spoke with researchers and historians who were trying to piece together a fuller picture of the Cold War prisoner exchange system. In one of these conversations, he was asked a direct question. Would you do it again? Knowing what you know now, would you still have gone to the Soviet Union in the summer of 1961? His answer, by most accounts, was not a simple yes, and it was not a simple no. He reportedly said something close to this, that the version of himself who made that decision was 22 years old and could not have known what the decision would cost. But the impulse behind the decision, the desire to understand, rather than simply fear, was not something he regretted. He regretted the cost. He did not regret the impulse. This is a distinction worth sitting with, because it applies far beyond Cold War espionage cases. It applies to anyone who has ever taken a risk that did not work out the way they hoped. You can regret the outcome without regretting the values that led you to take the risk in the first place. That is not weakness. That is not naivety. That is what it looks like to remain a coherent person across the gap between who you were before something terrible happened to you and who you become after. Marvin Makinen never publicly performed bitterness. He also never publicly performed forgiveness. He simply continued doing the work that mattered to him, which is, in the end, its own kind of answer to everything that was done to him. There is a particular kind of American story that this country tells about itself. Stories of triumph, of dramatic vindication, of villains clearly punished, and heroes clearly rewarded. Marvin Makinen's story is not that story. Nobody was punished for what happened to him. The KGB officers who interrogated him lived out ordinary careers within a system that no longer exists, but that, while it existed, faced no accounting for what it did to a 22-year-old student who had committed no crime. There was no dramatic vindication, no apology, no public recognition. That 8 years was a wildly disproportionate sentence for a man whose actual offense, if it existed at all, was curiosity. What there was simply this: a young man who endured something terrible and built a meaningful life on the other side of it. Not because justice was done, but because he decided that justice or no justice, his life was still his to build. That is a quieter kind of American story than the ones that usually get told. But it might be, in the end, the truer one. There's a question worth asking directly. What separates a story like this from simply being a piece of historical trivia? What makes it worth 40 minutes of your time today? The answer is not really about espionage or about the specific mechanics of how these exchanges actually worked. The answer is about a much older question, one that every generation faces in its own form. What do you do when the world treats you as smaller than you are? When systems larger than yourself make decisions about your life without consulting you, without explaining themselves, without particularly caring what happens to you as an individual? This happens in prisons, and it happens in hospitals. It happens in courtrooms, and it happens in corporate boardrooms. It happens whenever a person becomes a case number, a file, a statistic, rather than a human being, with a name and a mother, and a life that mattered to someone. Marvin Makinen's answer to that question was not heroic in any conventional sense. He did not fight back. He did not escape. He did not become a martyr for some larger cause. His answer was smaller and harder. He simply refused to let the system define who he was. They could put him in a cell. They could control his food, his temperature, his access to the outside world. They could not control what he did with his mind in the hours that remained his own. That same distinction between what can be taken and what cannot is, in the end, the entire substance of this story. Everything else, the bridges, the spies, the diplomatic maneuvering, is the container. This is what's inside it. A young man, stripped of nearly everything, who held on to the one thing that could not be confiscated, his own disciplined mind, and who walked out of Vladimir Prison 2 years later, carrying it intact. That deserves remembering. Whatever circumstances you yourself are facing, whatever feels right now like 4 walls and a small high window, you still have what Marvin Makinen had, the choice of what to do with your own mind in the hours that remain. Sincerely yours. If you've watched this story to the end, Leave a single word in the comments below. Just one. A word that stuck with you. And tell us which city you're watching from. We read every comment.